Good afternoon. It's so wonderful to see all of you here, especially since I'm honored to be introducing our speaker of today, Claire Heckel, who is part of the, who will be speaking as part of the seminar series at BGC for fall 2017. As you know, this event is being live cast and can be accessed later on the BGC TV channel. So a little bit about Claire and her background. She is currently the College postdoctoral fellow at the Division of Anthropology at the Richard Gilder Graduate School, American Museum of Natural History, which is a 2-year appointment. Claire is now in her 2nd year of the project, the postdoctoral fellowship project. Her research is centered on investment in social symbolic technologies, ranging from the evolution of personal adornment practices in the early Upper Paleolithic of southwestern Europe to dress and adornment practices of ethno-historical Native American populations of the Great Plains. Claire's approach to these objects is grounded in an anthropology of technology framework that emphasizes the intersections of identity, social organization, economic systems, environments, and technological choice. Methodologically, Claire's study of artifacts and ornaments from archaeological and ethnological contexts combines qualitative observations, morphometric and attribute analysis, physicochemical analysis, material science, microscopy, and experimental reproduction. She obtained a PhD in archaeological anthropology at NYU, currently a postdoctoral fellow, as I mentioned, at the AMNH, and is associated with the CNRS lab at the University of Toulouse in France. Claire has presented the results of her research in numerous articles in journals such as Quaternary International, the Journal of Archaeological Science, and has spoken at universities such as Harvard, Oxford, and Paris Sorbonne. It gives me much pleasure to introduce Claire Heckel and her talk today, which deals with Native American artifacts from the Great Plains, currently housed at the American Museum of Natural History and collected by ethnographers in the early 20th century.
Thank you, Armella, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. So the topic I'll be addressing is the application of archaeological science to the museum collections of the AMNH and the potential that these investigations have to kind of question some of the ethnographic accounts and received wisdom about them. So I am a prehistoric archaeologist and archaeological scientist by training, and my background is primarily in the field of early prehistory and the first Homo sapiens societies in Eurasia and their investment in social symbolic technologies. So I've mostly worked with mammoth ivory. These are very small beads from several caves and rock shelters in southwestern France. And because the shift from studying the adornment practices of Ice Age societies 40,000 years ago to studying historical populations on the Great Plains is such a large one, I wanted to briefly address how I made it. And really it hinges just on scientific approaches to symbolic material culture. So the ethnographic authority of these accounts. So through some readings on the subject of Native American sociology, history, and anthropology, and discussions with Peter Whiteley, the curator of North American ethnology at the AMNH, the present project took shape as a 2-year postdoctoral study titled Documenting Cultural Resistance and Environmental Adaptation in Great Plains Dress and Adornment, Archaeometric Analysis. The American Museum of Natural History holds an exceptional collection of Native American artifacts from all over North America, but also from the plains. And many of these are richly decorated objects of dress and adornment. So this count includes all types of objects, not just the objects of dress and adornment, but it does show that the most intensive, by far, collecting period was 1900 to 1920. So during, yes?
I have a quick question. Are you dealing with pre-contact period or post-contact period?
No, post-contact.
All post-contact?
Yeah, so these were collected by anthropologists working for the museum.
Right, okay, so there's a line there somewhere. There should be a line there somewhere between pre-contact and post-contact, because the material has changed.
And the most intensive collecting period was between 1900 and 1920. So not only is this post-contact, it's also post-reservation period. So the objects that were made between 1860 and 1920 during a time of extreme upheaval when Native American groups were facing multiple threats to their traditional lifeways that include assimilationist policies of Euro-American agencies, population devastation due to conflict and disease, radical changes in environment and the loss of traditional resources, and the cultural and political challenges of ethnically plural reservation environments in which multiple groups were forced together in close contact and forced to renegotiate their boundaries, identities, and relationships. So one of the responses to these pressures was an intensified investment in the category of formal dress. And I follow David Penny in his use of the term formal dress as an alternative to the more problematic term traditional dress that kind of assumes certain standards of what is and is not legitimately Native American. So, as Penny stated in reference specifically to the late 19th century, formal dress and formal occasions to wear it became a means of asserting a sense of cultural integrity. Dress, in this sense, symbolized both ethnic solidarity and difference from the dominant culture. So another important aspect that has shaped these collections and our understanding of them is the role that early anthropologists played in bringing these objects. And of these, 5 of them are anthropologists who are working for the museum: Alfred Kroeber, Clark Whistler, Robert Lowy, Alanson Skinner, and Pliny Goddard. And the ideological commitments of these early anthropologists have really shaped our understanding of the museum collections, particularly the concept of unified culture areas and diffusionist models of culture change have obscured what we now understand to be very much more complex histories and processes of cultural interaction and culture change. For example, these systems of organization and classification and curation have been criticized by Robert Boast as part of the ordered representations that contained, objectified, and reproduced the colonized world for the paternalistic imperialism that characterized the 19th and early 20th centuries. Furthermore, it's been stated by many researchers, here particularly Susan Sherrock, that these classification schemes are based on apparent but not actual relationships reflected in ethnological classificatory schemes such as tribal territorial boundary maps, culture area categorizations, and linguistic stock classifications. And what she means here is not that tribes didn't exist, but that this Euro-American insistence on classifying people in rigid tribal terms really doesn't reflect the complex realities of social identity and social interaction on the plains. And this includes the trade networks that were very important parts of North American, Native American life before and after Euro-American arrival. The fur trade capitalized on cross-continental trade networks that extend into prehistoric periods. And gifting was a very important part of Plains material culture. So objects and people were moving all over the place at the same time as anthropologists who were collecting for the museum were trying to pin them down and categorize them. And this has created some real challenges in attempts to understand the material culture and the historical sociopolitics of the Plains region. In particular, the misclassification of objects. So examples abound in the AMNH collections, but Kroeber's collection of so-called Arapaho parfleche is a particularly clear example. In his ethnography of the Arapaho, published in 1902, he writes extensively about the meanings of the designs on parfleche, but he doesn't seem to have asked anyone where the parfleche came from or who made them. And all of the examples that he collected, he brought back to the AMNH, cataloged as Arapaho, and published as Arapaho. And about a third of them are likely to actually be Arapaho. 2/3 of them, however, are very clearly not. They were probably acquired through gifting and exchange from groups such as the Crow, the Wind River Shoshone, who shared a reservation with the Northern Arapaho, also from the Dakota and other Siouan-speaking tribes, the Lakota as well, and the Apache. So although these were possessions of Arapaho people, cataloging and publishing them as Arapaho is not only inaccurate, it obscures the life histories of these objects, and it obscures the vital and vibrant intertribal relationships that were going on at the time, and that the United States government was particularly interested in suppressing. But reclassifying them in the museum database, according to the tribes that made them, also obscures these histories and erases them. So here we kind of see a way in which the database approach and our approach to classifying things as either this or that, kind of these dichotomous classifications, creates barriers to really understanding complexities of object life histories and their trajectories on social and geographic landscapes. So to briefly summarize some very complex issues rather succinctly, some of the problematic legacies of museum collection and curation are that they've applied foreign and inaccurate labels and categories to objects and people. They've obscured origins of objects as well as their trajectories of circulation, erased histories of complex social dynamics on the plains, contributed to images of Plains Indian culture as a uniform entity, framed Native Americans as passive victims of historical forces rather than as active agents responding to forces of oppression and assimilation with innovation and resilience. So here I'm referring to the vanishing Indian trope that was so heavily present in the anthropological efforts of the early 20th century. And they've created barriers to source community engagement. If people are trying to find out more, recover some of these lost traditions of crafting, mislabeled objects can provide them with misinformation or create barriers to them recovering and finding their cultural patrimony. So I'll spend the rest of this talk talking about the approaches I'm taking to these older objects that include reassessing the object classifications using attribute analysis rather than conventional typological approaches, more accurate raw material characterization focused on identifying substitutions and innovations, reconstructing longue durée histories of dress and adornment, drawing on a variety of sources, and reconstructing undocumented historical practices. So we'll return to the example of parfleche. In 1975, Mabel Morrow published a wonderful book on her study of parfleche, which was based on visits and interviews with women who were recognized as master parfleche makers in their communities. So rather than trying to make her own typology of these objects, she asked the women who were making them, what makes a parfleche Arapaho? What makes a parfleche Lakota? And through these results, I constructed an approach to reclassifying the parfleche in the AMNH collections. So I'll break down in more detail. And this stemmed kind of from my approaches in Paleolithic archaeology of attribute analysis, which in the 1990s and early 2000s really replaced typological approaches to stone tools and said, instead of just looking at it and generalizing, let's break these down to their components or attributes. So these include the number of perforations and their arrangement at the top. And you'll see already that these approaches to constructing parfleche don't break down neatly along linguistic lines. So there can be 3 pairs of perforations, a single perforation, a double perforation in the middle, and another single perforation, or 1 pair. There are groups that, so this is the part of the parfleche that is always decorated when they are decorated. Some groups include lines that connect these across the back of the parfleche. Some groups decorate the side flaps with additional motifs. And then there's a difference of whether exclusively straight lines are used or whether curved and straight lines are used. So here we can see that pretty much any combination of these different attributes is possible, and they can really help us to more accurately identify objects in the collection. Another element that we're examining is the object histories, their use. There are many tribes that only started making parfleche for the tourist trade when that really ramped up in the plains. So also looking at, for example, the object on the one hand that is clearly very old, clearly very used, and the object next to it, which not only have the holes not been perforated, so it's clearly not fully finished for use, it's also the rawhide is very pristine. There are no wrinkles or tears from repeated opening and closing. And on close examination, it's pretty clear that it was done in a fairly hasty manner compared to the ones that were circulating in purely native circles. There's just, the colors aren't filled in all the way, the lines are a little bit more sloppy. So getting clues about context through these examinations has also been important. And finally, doing PXRF analysis of the composition of the pigments. So 2 assays per color, and also comparing them to the unpainted areas. And for the most part, a lot of the pigments being used were the standard European trade pigments, but we are finding evidence of persistent use of native pigments. Here's an example on a plateau parfleche. There are 2 reds, and they've clearly been chosen for different elements of the design. There's a brighter red, which is vermilion. It's used in the triangles, but these longitudinal lines are red ochre, iron oxide, from a native source. And another thing we've noticed is that ceremonial objects use almost exclusively these earth pigments, which in many cultures are associated with particular places, have particular mythological significance, while the more quotidian objects tend to use the European trade pigments. So this is a pair of parfleche attributed to the Southern Cheyenne, and I did want to address, there was adoption of motifs, so further complicating this. Yes, objects were moving, but also people were inspiring each other. So you would get motifs being adopted from the Lakota by the Cheyenne, or from the Shoshone by the Crow, and these attributes can kind of help us recognize this. So this base design is very Arapaho in general. But the Southern Arapaho and the Southern Cheyenne were put on a reservation together. And this is very clearly a Cheyenne parfleche. And the reasons for that is the Arapaho would make a single perforation, pair of perforations in the middle. This one has the single pair single. Also, there's much more extensive use of these small black and brown motifs in addition to the color. And the colors are not colors that are generally, pigments that are generally used by the Arapaho. So in a detailed study of 80 of the parfleche at the AMNH, I found that 57% were correctly attributed and 43% were not. And this is really important because the ethnographic accounts and the studies of the anthropologists working at the AMNH have gained such authority that they're frequently cited as expert sources on what the material culture of the plains is like. For example, when Clark Whistler conducted a study of the decorative motifs on moccasins in the AMNH collections that were collected between 1890 and 1915, these collections were largely done by himself, by Lowy, and by Kroeber, he relied on the attributions that were recorded in the museum catalog, and his conclusions were that there were no clear tribal distinctions between moccasins. And this is based on these flawed cultural attributions, and it's also known to be untrue. If you talk to Native Americans, craftspeople, or even specialists just who have worked with Native American collections extensively, it's quite possible to find cultural differences, tribal differences in moccasin designs. But Whistler also comments in this article that that the anthropologists specifically tried to collect as many different examples as they could. So this would also skew these collections. Let's say the Lakota are making 90% of their moccasins look one way, but you want only one of each type. You're really going to create a homogenized representation of what these cultures are doing. So we're doing moccasin attribute analysis as well. I've had an intern from Columbia University helping me with this. We've constructed a 4-page data sheet, so far gotten through 543 moccasins that detail how they're constructed, how they're decorated, techniques of beading, techniques of quilling, and all of this in an effort. It works the same way as the parfleche study, but with the moccasins there are a lot more moving parts. It's a lot more complicated. And I'll address this a bit later on, but I also just returned from visits to tribal heritage centers in South Dakota and Oklahoma. So talking with native craftspeople has also been an element of trying to sort out some of this. So for example, from the Morgan and Lenders collection, a pair of Southern Cheyenne men's moccasins. And we can tell that they're Cheyenne because the toe marker is positioned directly on the toe. There's an odd number of motifs going around the border. You can see on one pair that the cuff actually slants very sharply toward the sole in the direction of the toe. And the notch in the tongue is characteristic of men's moccasins from the Southern Cheyenne. Here we have another pair of so-called Southern Cheyenne men's moccasins from the Morgan and Lenders collection that is very probably actually Lakota. So you can see that the toe marker is positioned slightly off-center. When I spoke to a Lakota moccasin maker, she said, if you put it directly on the toe, that means you don't know how to make moccasins. So also the cuffs are straight, parallel to the sole. Even though these are men's moccasins, both by what was recorded in the catalog and by their dimensions, there's no notch in the tongue, which would be a Cheyenne characteristic. So these are kind of subtle differences, and they're not differences that would emerge if you were doing a typology of decorative motifs, because it is true that in the beadwork, many tribes use many similar beading motifs. So I'll turn now to some of the patterns that have emerged in closer examinations of raw materials, and these include substitutions that were made as access to traditional materials and the trade networks that supplied them were interrupted. So for example, we have bird feather being used in quill work here in these mandan rosettes. There's also plant fiber, usually corn husk, used to replace quill work by the Southern Arapaho. Here's some more examples of dyed plant fiber. And it's interesting to note that it's the Southern Arapaho who start doing this, as they were most definitively pushed out of the distribution of the porcupine in North America. I've also noticed in the study of parfleche, even though almost all of the literature describes parfleche as made on buffalo hide, by the 1890s it's almost exclusively elk. And this determination can be made on the basis of the fur that's still left on the inside of the parfleche. Otherwise, characterizing hide, it can be done, but it's pretty difficult. But when there's the fur remaining on the inside, it's pretty easy to distinguish buffalo from elk. And the manufacture of bone facsimiles of elk teeth. So this is a mandan little girl's dress. It's pretty small. It's about this big. And only a few of these teeth, the ones indicated with red rectangles, are actual elk teeth. The rest are pretty convincing bone facsimiles. And through microscopic analyses of these, it's also interesting that the perforations on all of the bone copies are very fresh. They don't show much wear. The perforations on the actual elk canines are very used, very enlarged by repeated use. So it's also obvious that these actual teeth were recovered from other garments and recycled and reused and passed down generationally. So another approach to teeth, some more things that teeth can tell us as a prehistorian and someone who specializes also in animal materials and ivories. So elk ivory is actually the vestigial canines of elk, same for red deer in Europe. There's 2 of these teeth per animal, so that's one reason they're so widely used as demonstrations of wealth, is it takes an entire elk just to get 2 of these teeth. And so I invited a colleague of mine, Solange Rigaud, who has worked on the analysis of elk teeth in Mesolithic European contexts, to come and work with me on seeing what we could tell about the hunting practices of the Lakota at this time based on the teeth on this dress. So we went through, and there are 188 teeth. We analyzed each one individually for sex, for side of left or right, for also the occlusal wear on the surface, which indicates age. So we can start getting a little more specific about the animals that went into making this dress. So we have 111 males, 74 females, if we just look at the number of teeth and the sex of the animal. Right and left, 90 and 98. For the archaeologists in the room, the MNI, minimum number of individuals. This is a standard approach to looking at faunal assemblages, just calculating based on how many, if you have a left femur and a right femur, it could be from 2 animals, it could be from 1 animal. If you have 2 right femurs, it's definitely 2 different animals. So kind of taking this approach. So then combining the sex and the anatomical side, minimum of 56 males and 41 females. And then when we start looking at wear, we get a really interesting pattern. We can see there's a steep increase toward the older females, which indicates an avoidance of hunting females of reproductive age. So we can see herd management hunting practices here of kind of you kill males whenever they might be available, but you avoid killing the females that might be keeping your local herds alive. So a final element of this project is this reconstructing context and reconstructing longue durée histories, trying to show that change in Native American dress didn't happen just with Euro-American arrival. From earliest prehistory, these groups have been interacting with each other, influencing each other, and Native American fashion has been a dynamic, ever-changing phenomenon. So I've been using photographs, paintings and drawings by Native and non-Native observers, archives, ethnographies, archaeological data, and historical documents, with the idea that all of these can be biased in different ways, but if we combine them all together, we can start to get a really accurate idea of change over time. So for a brief example, I'll take the Omaha and the use of the roach. So here we have a portrait by Charles Bird King, and if you look at his portraits, he was very much doing European-style portraits, and the ornaments that people are wearing don't tend to vary very much from painting to painting. So he was really generalizing this kind of impression of Native Americanness. But also, dress changes with context. So the roach here is being worn by representatives, delegates who came to Washington to meet with the president. So they're in their formal dress, which may have included shaving the sides of the head, painting with vermilion, and wearing the roach. Whereas we have members of the same tribe here painted by Carl Bodmer on his trip with Maximilien von Wied up the Missouri River to the Yellowstone. And this is winter. They're just standing around. They're dressed very differently. This is just kind of everyday dress. But also in this account, Prince Maximilian writes that the roach was just beginning to be adopted by the Omaha and the Ponca, and that it was the young men who were adopting this trend from the Sac and Fox, who had been pushed into the area and were really a formidable political and military presence. Similarly with these Omaha men, this is the earliest daguerreotype known of the Omaha. This is another delegation to Washington. And we see these European-style tailored shirts worn with silver armbands at the wrists and the elbows. So we could say this goes back to 1852. However, the exact same remains of shirts under silver or pewter and brass elbow bands has been found at the archaeological site of Big Village dating back to the 1770s. So this is a style that was adopted even almost 100 years earlier. And for a change in moccasins, so these are some moccasins from the Meade collection from 1930 and some stereographic images from W.H. Jackson in 1872 showing, it's hard to see here, but they are wearing this style of moccasin, soft-soled, front-folding cuff, and generally decorated with just a single line of what used to be quills. Here it's beads. And this is also described in early travel accounts from the 1820s. However, we get a change when the Winnebago are resettled on the northern half of the Omaha Reservation. And there's this wonderful drawing from Dorsey's notebooks. This is from the Smithsonian archives, labeling these specifically as Omaha beadwork patterns on moccasins. And here are some examples from Mead's collection of 1930. So we can kind of pinpoint when this abstract floral beadwork emerged as well. So a final element is kind of taking all of this data and taking all of these findings and trying to engage them with contemporary discussions about the status, value, and potential of ethnographic collections, how they relate to different stakeholders in the world, and to also explore the historical formation and distribution of this object diaspora, and acknowledge its entanglement in networks, flows, and power disparities of colonialism. This has also included democratizing access to cultural heritage. So not only have I been going out to speak with communities and collect information, but also to share the information that we have, to talk with them about how can this research based in these large institutions on the East Coast be a little more accountable, be more transparent, and be more collaborative. But also, I've left CDs with our entire collections, as well as scanned copies of archival documents with tribal libraries, heritage centers, colleges, in an effort to relocalize some of this research so that it can be independently conducted within the communities as well. So I'll close with this call from Harmon for more histories of Indian identity. So hopefully these scientific engagements and conversations with extant communities will serve this. By asking how Indian people have defined and redefined themselves, historians can explain Indians' power to change without forfeiting a collective existence. And by investigating Indians' part in the establishment and maintenance of ethnic boundaries, historians can invigorate not only Indian studies, but also the broader field of North American studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was really very invigorating and thought-provoking. So I'm just going to open up the floor to questions for Claire.
The more general question would be the outsider's slight registering of surprise that the application of archaeometric methods to ethnographic collections is so unusual or rare. That's just a general question. And the, I guess, more specific would be what you as an archaeologist have learned about archaeology from undertaking this particular reversal of practice.
So I'll break that two questions. The first, I do think in this context, what kind of struck me about this ethno-historical period is that it tends to fall between the disciplinary cracks. It's too old for sociocultural anthropologists, it's too new for archaeologists, it didn't come out of archaeological excavations. So kind of the people who end up engaging with these things are museum employees, conservators, and in talking with some of the conservators and employees at the AMNH, they have lamented also that they don't get to do that on an extended basis. That they'll study objects in preparation for a new exhibit and then they move on to another category. So they collect a lot of knowledge, but it's bits and pieces, and it's this sustained examination that tends to be lacking in museum contexts. And the second question was, okay, what learning about archaeology? I think as a prehistorian, I was interested not at all in Native Americans as prehistoric peoples, but in checking some of our assumptions, because we do have texts of saying, okay, if I take these purely object-oriented approaches, how might they be contradicted by textual information? So I think it was an interesting way, kind of a check and balance on having both sources of information.
Okay. my experience with this is I'm a docent at the museum, and I'm frequently in the Hall of Northwest Coast Indians, and the hall is still called Indians. They haven't changed the name, okay? And that collection is the original collection from when Franz Boas went out to the Northwest and spent 4 years out there with somebody named Hunt, who was part Indian and part Westerner, and they collected almost all of the stuff that's in that exhibit. And that exhibit has not been changed in a very long time. And I know personally that there are things in there that are wrong, okay? So just as you said, the museum doesn't have I won't use the word manpower, the person power to go in there and change it around that much, okay? So they're sort of stuck in time. Okay, but now they're making an attempt to bring it up to date. Have you been in that hall?
Yes, I was actually just there last week because you may have heard that it's being redone, the Northwest Coast Hall. So tomorrow, actually, there's a large delegation of representatives from all of the tribes who are represented there, who will be spending the week at the museum with the conservators and the curators, talking with them. So the goal is to do that with all of the halls, but as you said, we don't have the resources to do it all at once. So really the first big revision of a hall is going to be this Northwest Coast exhibit. And to get people in and get input from representatives of these tribes on how they're being represented.
The reason I brought up the question at the beginning of the contact period and before the contact period, because things radically changed in contact period, because there was a demand for all of this handicraft, right? So they almost went into mass production making them, and also the use of beads and coloration. They no longer use the porcupine quills for decorations because they got glass beads from Europe. So here it changed the culture tremendously. And I personally know of there's a piece of copper hanging in that hall that's probably 3 feet tall on this high, and it has a crease in the center, or a dimple in the center. They couldn't have made that. They didn't have the technology to do that. That had to have been made by metal workers who had a forge or a foundry. Okay, they had no way to make that bend in this piece of copper. So I surmised that that piece of copper came from a copper-clad ship, and they bought the copper, or they acquired it somehow from a European ship. Okay, but there's no signage that says anything about it. So there's a huge, huge problem in this hall, and it reflects in the Plains Indian Hall also, of changing it around. And when you change it around, what are you going to use for your sources? So you said that they're going to get a whole bunch of native peoples to come in the hall, and maybe that'll do a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty much, I think, standard practice in museums now. There's an awareness that if you're going to represent native peoples, they need to be involved in telling their story. So these tribal representatives are going to be involved from the planning stage through the completion and opening. And hopefully they'll get around to doing the same thing in the Plains Hall.
See, the Plains Hall is next, do you think?
I have absolutely, I'm a postdoc. I'm there for 2 years. I
thank you, Claire. This was wonderful. And the work you are doing is really good. And trying to identify each object and really get the truth as to where they originated. That's wonderful. Now, I worked at the museum, I must have seen you around for over 40 years, and we are office mates, Claire and I. So I just like to comment on the cataloging of the collections. The objects were catalogued according to where they were collected, even if the collector knew that getting something from the Crow, as Lowe did, that it actually was made by one of the Sioux groups, because that was considered their cultural stuff at the time. And with many of these objects, when it's then later on maybe found out exactly where, then we make this correction in the remarks field, so made. And actually a good example comes from Amazonia, which is my first area. Within the Xingu area, Xingu River area, there are 7 different groups, and only one group makes pottery, and that's the Waura. They all trade, and all the groups use the Waura pots. So we collect them as Waura made pot, but it's collected from the Kuikuru. So it's a Kuikuru pot. So in that sense, yes, it's not really accurate, but it's considered these tribes.
Yes, and it's not inaccurate. And also, I wish I'd included some photos here from the TransMississippi Indian Congress, where you can see everyone is wearing each other's stuff.
Yeah.
So there are, and these were symbols of I have important contacts. It's like wearing fine European clothing here, or historically, that Native Americans of that time would have distinctly recognized something as Kiowa, Apache, Cheyenne, but so they were being used in, so if I'm an Omaha person wearing all of these different things, they are my possessions. They're being used in a performance of Omaha identity. So yeah, again, we don't want to just go reclassify them because that causes the same, but I think it's interesting that the database approach is a phenomenon of Euro-American kind of museum practices that forces these rigid, and Native people may have had words, categories for these things that cross boundaries.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the estimated time and labor that went into making some of these amazing objects. For example, the moccasins, speaking with contemporary makers and what you've read about their production and where you know all of these different elements that create such an amazing object, where they come from. I know you can't probably quantify hours, but if you could just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think if we look at, from hunting the animal to cleaning the hide, that's a labor intensive. That would probably take a couple of hours. Then you've got to cut, or several hours, because beating the hair off of the hide and curing it, and then the beadwork does take hours and hours. But I think a lot of this investment, as from an archaeological perspective, would be, hunters and gatherers tend to have a lot of free time. So the creation of value and wealth through investiture of time in these things. There's a great master's thesis that's available online about Lakota dress and the female creation of economic value that kind of really gives a lot of details on female prestige and craftsmanship. And but as when European traders arrived and kind of plugged themselves into the fur trade and really accelerated it, I think they really recognized that beads and pigment were already things that were circulating in those. When I showed that image of the cross-continental trade networks, what they were already trading were pigments from the plateau and the west coast, shells, dentalium. We have dentalium shells from the coast that show up all the way inland even before European. So I think kind of they were just plugging in their goods to things that were already valued as exchange items natively.
Oh, I just had a question about the archaeological collections at the AMH, and if you've been able to look at any of those, if those have been informing any of this project. I don't recall moccasins, or but if there are objects of personal adornment within the archaeological collections, or what's the relationship, or is there a relationship between the anthropological collections and the North American archaeology?
We don't have much, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lila, but there's not a lot of archaeological plains material at the AMNH. It's almost exclusively, and
Southwest is the biggest
yeah.
area,
What makes it difficult with beadwork is if you've got beaded hide, and the hide disintegrates, you're left with a handful of beads and you have no idea how they were. So I've been reading archaeological reports, for example, the Big Village report, to kind of get an idea of that. But also, you know, pre-contact, there weren't really plains societies. People were not living full-time on the plains, and certainly not at the scale they were by the time the horse arrived. So the Plains Indian, as it exists in the American popular imagination, is kind of a post-contact phenomenon. So I think one thing we can tell is maybe from the archaeological record when beads arrived to certain areas, but then trying to figure out how they were sewn onto things is...
Or maybe analogs of design on ceramics, or smaller, like personal adornment items, spirit animals, or different kinds of.
Yeah, I think pipestone is one of the things of the symbolic material on the plains, because they weren't using ceramics usually, but things like pipestone and effigies kind of could provide an insight into that.
So I have a question actually. There seems to be a tension here where you are working within the museum system, which already, you've inherited these typologies and these categories, and at the same time you're using things like attribute analysis. In addition to that, you're starting very clearly from David Penny's division of formal and everyday dress. So I'm just wondering, in a sense, I guess, in a very friendly way to say, what are the possible pros and cons of using this kind of approach? We all need a starting point, I completely understand that. But if you are going to go further with this research, what would you say are the limitations?
Well, I think regarding formal dress and everyday dress, these are categories that really are referring to the manufacture. Like by 1860, what most Native Americans on the plains were wearing every day was identical to what farmers, Euro-American farmers, were wearing. It was store-bought, or at least the cloth was store-bought, shirts, dresses, pants. So the formal dress is now what we would call regalia, powwow regalia, things like that. So I think that division is just kind of saying, I think those would be two different questions, studying the adoption of Euro-American dress through photographs, and also this provides the opportunity, I meant to comment earlier on the fact that also our idea of how decorated things were has been influenced, that it's the shiny, colorful objects that attracted the eye of the ethnographers, and most of them note in their ethnographies the majority of parfleche are not painted, the majority of moccasins are not beaded. So like, as you brought up, Alicia, the time investment in this, of course not every pair of moccasins had hundreds of hours of investment in them. So you would have your everyday moccasins and you would have your special occasion moccasins. So really what we see in the Plains Hall is people in formal dress, but they're displayed as if they're just sitting around. When you walk into the Plains Hall, there are all of these people in full ceremonial regalia just kind of sitting around a teepee doing everyday things. So, and there's been a lot of great articles in a number of fields written about how the Plains Indian became, in the non-Native American imagination, kind of the standard. We see that the headdress, all of the. So I think those are interesting categories to interrogate, and I think as far as moving forward, part of the reason I went to visit communities was also to talk to them about how can we. Because to me, I think the collection of scientific data and the construction of historical and social narratives are two different processes. And I think that while I have the skills to collect these data, perhaps reframing them in rewritten narratives of Native culture change is something that should happen within the communities.
So I think I just have one last comment if nobody has anything else to add. I think what is really interesting for me about this, I really respect the point you made about how this has the potential to become another project. I was also thinking that part of that taking it forward could be talking about this research within the paradigm of religion and power, as well as the whole idea of performance, right? So we have this notion of the stasis of the iconographic approach, whereas a lot of things you were talking about were not just the techniques of making something, but the way the object was actually being used. And also your point about the fact that these objects were being made at a certain point in history for tourist consumption, perhaps. So the question of intentionality of making.
And the great thing with the moccasins, for example, is, and there is an article, forget the name of the author, but he compared moccasins made for tourists to moccasins made for wear, just on the basis of when moccasins are heavily worn, you get a clear foot impression. So looking at the AMH collections, the plains, I haven't found a single unworn pair of moccasins. Many of them are worn through to the bottom, so that's, for example, there are ways to kind of parse out, was this bought by a tourist and set on a shelf for years, or the two par fleche that I showed, one is just all, it's very soft and pliable, it's clearly been used for decades, the other is rigid, pristine, unused.
One last thing, what about the potlatch ceremony? Was that practiced on the plains?
No.
As well as the Canadian bands in the West Coast?
Toward the plateau, there may have been some influence, I'm not sure, but in the plains proper, they kind of had their own gifting. It was pretty much whenever you visited someone, there was an elaborate gifting. So it's kind of the same idea of conspicuous generosity, achieving status through generosity. But I think the particular ceremonies that were involved were very different from the potlatch.
And I can see very clearly your previous work in prehistory, the papers you published on bead analysis and the detail is paying off in your work on the elk teeth, for example. But there's also this huge, evolution in your own career between the work you were doing earlier and this project. So how do you reconcile the two if there is one?
I think I'm just enjoying applying my methods wherever I can. Looking at my interest is reading symbolic material culture in a more dynamic, complex way than is sometimes done in, all fields.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think